when in doubt, just pause or run away, right? Well, affirmative action is on trial. Today, a critical decision by the Supreme Court may decide who gets into college. At issue is Michigan's Prop 2, a law banning any consideration of race in public college admissions. But can a law meant to cut down on discrimination be discriminatory? Here to weigh in, Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano.
It's hard to follow, Brian.
No. So I'm not.
Oh, boy.
So
all right, so
this is an interesting case.
Yes, and it's a long saga in the state of Michigan involving its terrific public university, the University of Michigan,
yes,
owned by the state. So a couple of years ago, the University of Michigan was openly using race as a basis for admitting students. Its argument was a diverse class,
sure,
a racially diverse class helps everybody. The people who got in there because we gave them a little bit of a boost because of their race, and other people because they're exposed to different types of people. Supreme Court basically said, you can do that, you can use race, it can't be the deciding factor, it can't be the principal factor, but it can be a factor. Public in Michigan didn't like it, and the public at a referendum, a November election, voted to amend the Michigan Constitution to prohibit all aspects of Michigan government, from police to school boards to University of Michigan, from using race for any reason.
Right.
And that is now been challenged before the Supreme Court. Two lower federal courts said, you can't do that. You can't have such an absolute ban in your Constitution.
It's universal, too universal, right? They were saying.
Well, here's the issue. One argument is the whole reason we have the 14th Amendment, one of the three post-Civil War amendments, is to prohibit the states from using race. We all know the horrible history of states using race to treat people differently in America. So can the state of Michigan say, you cannot take race into account under any circumstances? You, the government, have to be colorblind. Two lower federal courts said no. This will be argued before the Supreme Court this week.
Right, and argued by Mark Rosenbaum. He's a chief counsel for the ACLU, who basically wants Michigan to be able to set its own admission policy aside from the state. But how can they do that if it's a state-run university?
Well, they can't. They can't. But the University of Michigan, which, again, I can't underscore enough, the high level of education there, nevertheless, has to follow state law, like everybody in Michigan has to follow state law, especially if you are owned by the state and the state says you can't use race. The confusing thing is the Supreme Court has failed to give very crystal clear rules to states as to when they can use race and when they can't. And that's why this keeps coming back.
Okay.
This is another opportunity for the Supreme Court to say, here's the law. When
Clearly.
Justice O'Connor wrote an opinion about race and Michigan, she said, the University of Michigan can use race, but only for the next 25 years. When the Supreme Court gives ambiguous rulings like that, it creates confusion.
Sure.
Hopefully this is the opportunity for them to say, once and for all, you can use race, you may use race, you can never use race.
Sure. Maybe an opportunity to define that clearly,
yes,
as you just said, Judge. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, Elizabeth.
Let's get to our senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Well, we've backed away from the cliff, at least. The country's not going to collapse and take the world with it.
You know, tomorrow is the day that the Secretary of the Treasury said he'd need more money in order to pay the government's bills. It turns out there's enough money in the till to pay the government's bills until the end of the year. So the idea that the government would default, that it couldn't pay vendors, people who sold food to the government, or it couldn't pay lenders, people who loaned money to the government who were due interest on those loans as of tomorrow, was pretty much a made-up trick by Democrats in order to scare people into voting for this. On the other hand, the government is so big. The government provides benefits and subsistence to so many innocent people who have relied on the government, who are suffering when the government is shut down, that level of pain and suffering finally reached Republicans who said, we have to decide between, do we really want this to go on much longer, or pick another fight for another day when we can decide whether or not we want the government to keep borrowing and add to the $17 trillion debt.
A number of Republicans have told me that there was another factor, too. And that was that Wall Street Journal NBC News poll that came out in the middle of the week that showed their favorability rating as a party had dipped to 24%, and no Republican wants that.
I think that the Democrats did a better job in the PR game of blaming the Republicans for the government shutdown. But it was the president, I suggest to you, who refused to negotiate, who basically said my way or the highway. He managed to deflect the heat from him, though his own approval ratings are way down.
They are indeed.
And make it look like the Republicans in the House were the bad guys. In my view, the Republicans in the House were doing their best to preserve the value of the dollar and constitutional government as we understand it. But it got to the tipping point where there was just too much suffering out there. End this is going to come back to us. Lindsey Graham said this morning, I'm voting for it, but I think it's absurd because we're going to be back on the same boat in the middle of February when this borrowing power and this budget run out.
The thing is, we have two competing views, as we always do in this country, of how to make things work.
Yes.
One side says we need to spend less money. The other side says, okay, maybe we spend a little less money, but we need more revenue as well.
Yes.
And that's the battle point. But that was not what their focus was. Their focus started out with Obamacare, a fight which most Republicans now admit they could never have won, and they knew it.
Well, the Constitution contemplates a two-part step for all laws. First is to pass the law, and second is another vote on funding the law.
Right.
So Senator Cruz, even though he got under some people's skin, in my opinion, brought out the best in many conservative values, which is just because this thing was passed doesn't mean we have to pay for it if we don't have the money to pay for it. Now, that view did not prevail numerically in the Congress, but it's a view that resonated with a lot of folks back home.
Judge Napolitano, it's nice to see you.
It is always a pleasure to be with you, especially in these digs.
It's very nice here.
Gorgeous place.
I'm going to make it colder.
Make
much
it colder.
to the dismay of the information specialists behind you.
They're used to you by now.
Yeah, they are. Thank you, Judge.
A deal or raw deal, if you think the raising of the debt ceiling is just another news story with no impact on you, you're wrong. It's actually just another excuse for the federal government to tax you. Here to break it all down is Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. And that's really, Judge, what it is. Anytime we increase our debt, that really is a way for the federal government to tax us more because we're letting them.
Give you one statistic. Woodrow Wilson borrowed $30 billion to fund World War I in 1917. That money has not been paid back, and we are still paying interest on it. That's 95 years ago.
Wait a minute, we paid interest, but we haven't paid the principal?
Correct. We have rolled the principal over. So we paid back the people that loaned it to us by borrowing more money. Right, right. So the total cost of that $35 billion has more than doubled. And who pays for that? The American taxpayer pays for it with cheaper dollars, because the government prints money to pay its bills, and that reduces the value of everything we own. The American taxpayer pays for it with higher taxes. Sure. The government yesterday, Steve, literally borrowed money, or actually they'll start the borrowing today as a result of the vote last night. The government today will borrow money in order to pay debt on money it has already borrowed and spent. Now, who in their right mind, when they owe a mortgage payment to a bank, goes out and borrows the money to make that mortgage payment? Because at some point, you have to pay all this back.
No bank would ever lend you the money because they'd go, you could never pay that back. Of course, this is the government. And they got all that,
they have the Federal
all those
Reserve.
printing presses.
They have the Federal Reserve, which can print all the cash they want. And now, because the Democrats bullied the Republicans last night, they have the ability to borrow more money, and the president can spend as he wishes for another 90 days. You know, we're going to be through this, going through this again in February.
Right, and we were just talking during the break that, you know, mainstream media is talking about it. This is a big win for the president of the United States, but at the same time, keep in mind, he tried to destroy the Republican Party in the process. He's going to be a lame duck to many, and the Republicans are now super energized.
The Republicans are absolutely energized, and the president's leadership was reprehensible all across the board. Refusing to talk to the other side of Capitol Hill, what kind of... Could you imagine FDR or Reagan or even Nixon or LBJ behaving that way? We haven't had a president. My way or the highway. I'm not even going to talk to you till you agree to vote for me. Right. I don't remember that in my lifetime.
Sure. And, you know, there are a lot of Americans in this country who have been successful, are being taxed in all, once you factor in state taxes and local taxes and everything else, north of 50%. They keep taking more and more and more, and eventually, for some, the good news is the government's there to rescue you. Only half the country pays federal taxes anyway.
And the other half of the country would just as soon receive benefits from the government than work.
But don't they get it at some point? You know, the people who are, you know, paying for the light bill, they're going to get sick and tired of it and either say, you know, it's not worth it for me to work so hard, or I'm leaving.
Interesting thing about the vote last night, the ability of the government to spend money and to borrow money, the time period keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter. These things used to go for a year, then 6 months, now 3 months. At some point, there will be insufficient numbers to keep borrowing. What will the president do then if he can't print cash and spend it?
Sure. You've written a great essay. Where is it today?
Oh, it's on FoxNews.com and on the Washington Times.
Very nice. Judge, thank you very much.
Stevie. Pleasure.
All right.
Well, now that the shutdown showdown is in the rearview mirror, does the New Deal get to the root of the problem? We're talking about America's skyrocketing national debt. With me now, Judge Andrew Napolitano, Fox News senior judicial analyst and friend. Welcome to my new show, Judge.
Oh, Gretchen, congratulations on the new show and the beautiful set, and it's a joy to be with you.
Thanks so much.
I somehow think it should be 6:30 in the morning.
Oh, let's not do that. Let's not do that. I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Here's what you said in an article that you wrote. If the mindset is to borrow and spend, and damn the future persists, America's society as we know it, it will collapse. You're serious about this?
Yes, I am serious about that. I realize that Senator Klobuchar, your family friend, has the best interests of the country at heart, but she has a fundamental misunderstanding of economics. I mean, here's what the government did. The government this morning borrowed money in order to pay interest on loans it has already received and spent. So it would be like us owing, you or me owing a mortgage payment and not having the money to make the payment and going out to borrow money to make the mortgage payment and expecting never have to pay it back.
So the government's addicted to spending.
Yes. Woodrow Wilson borrowed $30 billion to pay for World War I. We are still paying the interest on that. It still hasn't been paid back. Presidents and big government people like Senator Klobuchar are just interested in the political gain they get when they spread wealth around. They are not interested in the economic consequences of that debt. It reduces the value of the dollar. It causes inflation. Fully 1/5 all of the money that the federal government collects in taxes, $500 billion, is interest paid to interest on the loans the federal government has taken.
I know you believe that the president should have chosen to rein in the spending. So my next question is, when does it stop, and does it?
I don't think it will stop under this president unless the Congress absolutely refuses to raise the debt ceiling. If Speaker Boehner had gone along with the majority of Republicans in the House and said, no, stop, no more borrowing, then the president would be without authority to borrow money to pay interest on the debt.
So here's a fact that people are going to be just absolutely stymied by. We are still paying interest on the $30 billion that Woodrow Wilson borrowed to pay for World War I?
Right. That's the point that I make. Yes, really. Now, they paid back the people that loaned the $30 billion, but they paid it back with additional loans. They just basically rolled it over. That $30 billion that Wilson used to fund the war between 1917 and 1919, we're talking about 95 years ago, has now cost us $60 billion. Because of all the interest that we have paid and the other fees attendant upon rolling it over. The government never pays down the principal. The government doesn't care about that. It just cares about its ability to spend cash and, candidly, give the cash away.
And the feedback you've received from this article?
Pretty good. Pretty good. From people that voted the other way than Senator Klobuchar.
All right. Judge, I love you, and I love your laugh, and it's always great to get your insight.
Thanks for having me, Gretchen. All the best.
And the court papers say the gang said, quoting here, gotta get those crackers, calling them white MFers and other derogatory names. All of the suspects have been charged with assault. Only the 18-year-old has been charged with a hate crime. Police say it means that he deliberately targeted those people for their race, their religion, or their sexual orientation, Megan. Just the 18-year-old.
Trace, thank you. So why just him? Why not the rest of them? Joining me now, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Why? Why would it be just the 18-year-old?
Well, we need to know more of the facts in the case, which the police obviously are still developing. There's still people out there who they believe were involved in the case that they haven't arrested yet and they haven't had a chance to interrogate. But to charge somebody with a hate crime in New York City means that you believe you can prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim was chosen because of the victim's race, not because he beeped the horn, not because his car happened to be there, not for any other reason. That's a very difficult burden to overcome. So the police must believe they have enough evidence to prove that with respect to the 18-year-old, but not the others.
You can get to these hate crimes when you hear somebody say, let's get him because he's white, let's get him because he's black, let's get him because he's gay. But but not if during the course of the assault it's just a random slur that's uttered?
Yes, the law requires that the victim have been selected because of the hated characteristic, race, sexual orientation, whatever it may be. Here, race.
All right, so it can't be. Oh, he cut me off. I'm going to beat him. Oh, it turns out he's white, and I'm going to call him a cracker.
Correct.
That doesn't get you a hate crime charge.
Correct. And if the government charges a hate crime, and that's all the evidence they have overcharged, and they'll weaken the whole case against this guy.
Can you be charged with a hate crime if you're under 18? Because they've got the 18-year-old now, supposedly, but not the younger ones.
Yes, you can be charged with a hate crime if you're under 18. But remember, if you're under 18 and you're going to be tried as a juvenile, the trial will be in secret and the charges will be in secret, theoretically to protect the identity of the juvenile in case they're acquitted, or even if they're convicted. It's a different proceeding for children. However, the government could argue to a juvenile court judge, even though they're under 18, even though they're under 16, their behavior was so heinous, only a person with an adult mentality could have done it. Therefore, we want you to move them up to the adult court and try them as an adult.
Do you think if we don't hear more about these types of crimes and these types of cases, that this will continue to happen? Because, you know, what happens is you see that one of these cases get a lot of attention, and then maybe somebody in the future, black or white, whatever it is, stops and pauses and thinks, I don't want to get involved in that. I don't want to attack somebody because of their race. I don't want to be the center. I don't want to be the next George Zimmerman put on trial and alleged to be a racist and so on.
Well, think about this. There's no death in this case. It's a severe beating, but the victim's going to live. Nevertheless, the person charged with a hate crime is facing 174 years in jail if convicted of every charge that the police have filed, and if the judge is able to add to the penalty because the state can prove that he chose his victims because of their race. On the other hand, if you remove race from the case, it's a neater, cleaner, more just result, because jurors tend to resolve the case on the facts and not on the racial aspects.
You don't like hate crime charges.
I've seen too many good cases go south because of the racial aspect.
Upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously.
Yes, when the victim was chosen for race, not when the victim was ridiculed because of race.
Yeah, it can't be ancillary to the crime. Judge, thank you so much, sir.
Pleasure,
We'll continue to follow it.
Yes, we will.
This could be the EPA's most dramatic power grab ever, enforcing a federal regulation to gain control of nearly all the water in the country. So what does it mean for your property rights? Here to weigh in is Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, good morning to you.
Good morning, Steve.
What are they trying to do?
The EPA is redefining the meaning of the word water so as to give it, the EPA, the ability to regulate every body of water in the United States, whether it's a little stream or whether it's a freestanding pond. They have done this by finding a bogus scientific study which says the following: under the earth, way down in the bowels of the earth, all of these bodies of water are connected to each other. Now, why is the EPA saying that? Because when Congress wrote the Clean Water Act, it didn't define water, so the Supreme Court supplied a definition of water. Right. And the Supreme Court's definition of water for EPA purposes is it's got to be connected to navigable waters.
Okay, so they want to control all water. Why?
There's something about government that it always grows. It always wants to regulate more. It always wants to write more rules. It always wants to control more behavior. And the EPA is an extreme example of this. President Obama has put onto the EPA extreme environmentalists who want to regulate every aspect of our lives. So how does this affect you? If you have a little bit of water on your property, you can't build near that water if this regulation comes to pass without the approval of the federal government. Never mind that you need a local building permit. Never mind that the tax assessor is going to raise your taxes because you built a new garage or a barn or an addition on your house. You need permission of the bureaucrats in Washington. That's going to cost a lot more money, and it's going to take a lot longer, and that's going to decrease the value of your property.
And if you don't live up to the letter of the EPA law, then the fine is $37,000 a day.
$37,500 a day when you defy the EPA. This is the most draconian fine for anything anywhere in the United States of America.
How are they getting away with this?
Sometimes they get away with it, sometimes they don't. When the Supreme Court reined them in a couple of years ago, they dropped about 90% of the cases that they were pursuing.
You think this is on that same track?
Yes, I do. But in the interim, a lot of good, decent, hardworking people are going to fall victim to these monsters in Washington because the president believes that they should be able to control these aspects of our lives.
It all falls under the Clean Water Act. We all want clean water, but we don't want this.
No, I can't imagine anybody except the regulators wanting this.
Of course. All right, Judge Napolitano, thank you very much.
Pleasure, Stevie.
Didn't know about that, did you?
Garrett Tenney live with more outside the courthouse in Columbus this afternoon. How did Cordell himself react to his sentence in court today, Garrett?
Well, Shep, he was actually just relieved to have this entire case over with. That's according to his attorneys. The 22-year-old, he said all along that he would accept whatever punishment it is that he received, and he didn't diverge from those sentiments today while he was addressing the court. He expressed remorse for his actions and his desire to ensure that nobody else has to go through what this family has gone through as a result of his actions. You mentioned the daughter of the victim. We heard from her as well, and she said she believes that Cordell is sincere and she hopes that he is successful in encouraging others to not drink and drive. But she said none of that can bring her father back.
I've heard time and time again about a message. But the message I do not want to send is if you hit and kill someone, all you have to do is admit to it later and get leniency.
And Cordell will be serving every day of those 6.5 years as he is not eligible for parole. And his attorneys told us after the case today that there was going to be no appeal. Shep.
Garrett Tenney outside the courthouse in Columbus. Let's get to Judge Andrew Napolitano, our senior judicial analyst who's live on the news deck in New York. Judge, what do you make of this sentence?
I think it was unduly harsh, and I think the reason it was harsh is because of the publicity that was generated by the unique and almost bizarre way in which it came to the attention of the police. Normally, 6.5 years in jail means you're available for a parole, so somewhere between 4, 4.5, and 5. But 6.5 straight years in jail for a crime that he did not intend to commit. Obviously, he was too drunk to form the intent. A crime that he helped solve for the police is actually an unlawful sentence because in Ohio, you are supposed to be given credit for your remorse, and he wasn't.
An unlawful sentence?
Yeah. You see, the statute, I realize that the victim suffers egregiously, the young lady that we just heard. And obviously, no sentence can alleviate her suffering. And every victim wants the defendant to get a maximum sentence. But Ohio law requires a judge to give credit to a defendant who shows remorse and who helps the police solve his own crime. Now, this guy did both to an extreme example. He preached to youth, don't do what I did. And he told the police who he was and that he did it when they had no indication of who he was. He was not rewarded for that, and Ohio law requires that he be so rewarded. But if they're not going to appeal this sentence, he's going to be stuck with the 6.5 years, even though the sentence was unlawful.
And they've said they're not going to appeal, right?
Right. So he will endure that. Look, not all judges agree with me. Some believe that drunk drivers should be sentenced to the max, and that's the only way to stop this scourge. In fact, it's not a crime of intent. Usually these people are so drunk they don't even realize they're driving the car. So putting them in jail for all these years is not going to solve the problem. But encouraging them to be remorseful, rewarding the remorse, encouraging them to confess, rewarding the confession, encouraging them to come forward and rewarding them to do so will help in the future, and that's not what happened here.
Judge Andrew Napolitano, our senior judicial analyst, live back in New York. Judge, thanks very much.
Of course.
All right, get this. A brand new report suggesting Hillary Clinton's State Department leaked confidential national security secrets to the New York Times reporter David Sanger. These leaks allegedly exchanged for writings that made the department look tougher. And I wonder what role it played in his best-selling book. Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano has more on the cozy relationship that spilled sensitive national security secrets thanks to FreedomWorks and their request from the government to get some documents.
I have to start out by saying I am surprised that the government replied to the Freedom of Information Act request by FreedomWorks with this information that is utterly damning of the government. Look, all governments...
They would have eventually been forced to, wouldn't they?
Ultimately, yes. But they could have delayed it until President Obama was out of office. But they
should say Freedom Watch. Yeah.
FreedomWorks is the group that asked for this stuff.
Okay.
Look, all governments leak information. We know that. But when the government leaks national security secrets in return for favorable treatment in the press, The government is showing its hypocrisy because it is violating the very same statute that it's attempting to prosecute Edward Snowden for violating. Snowden has a better defense. Snowden's defense was, I was a whistleblower. The government was breaking the law. I felt morally and legally bound to reveal it. Their objective was, we needed better treatment in the New York Times. So we fed this guy national security secrets so he would write nice things about us.
It's incredible, too. There was a perception that they wanted to come out, that they were tough in this situation, for example. Here's an email from then Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, Michael Hammer, to a colleague we know, Felipe Reyes, who's the tight guy with Hillary Clinton. Says, yes, White House is cooperating. He has spent time with Donnellan and others. They know he is looking to meet up with HRC, Hillary Rodham Clinton, and support. This is David Sanger.
Correct. And Donnellan is Tom Donnellan, who at the time was President Obama's chief national security advisor, the job Henry Kissinger had in the Nixon administration. So you're talking about people possessing the most sensitive national security secrets the country has, intentionally leaking them to a newspaper reporter so that they can be portrayed favorably.
So let's think about this. James Rosen, he's getting a leak. They have to find the answer. Who is the leaker to James Rosen? They have to do their covert investigation. Meanwhile, they are overtly cooperating with David Sanger.
You're exactly correct. And again, it shows their hypocrisy. They got James Rosen's personal emails and telephone numbers to try and find out who he was talking to, while they themselves were talking to somebody at the New York Times, spilling far more sensitive national security secrets than what James was getting from his sources in the State Department.
And where does this go from here?
It probably goes nowhere. It'll be resolved in the court of public opinion. I can't imagine that the Justice Department is going to prosecute people in their own White House. It doesn't mean that a president, fill in the blank, who would succeed President Obama couldn't prosecute those people.
Right.
The statute of limitations is 5 years.
Bob, just know Hillary Rodham Clinton's there, and she is going to be running for president, it seems. Judge,
She'll have to answer for this one, bro.
Well, yeah, it'll be interesting.
So did the judge get it right in his decision to release this indictment against John and Patsy Ramsey? John Ramsey, speaking through his attorneys, does not think so. Let's bring in our own Judge Andrew Napolitano, Fox News senior judicial analyst. Judge, what do you think? You know, John Ramsey did not want this indictment released because he thinks that it will obviously be a smear campaign, he believes, against him if that's all people are going to see and they're not going to see the rest of the record.
Well, Allison and Bill, Colorado has a very unique statute which says that if an indictment was signed by the foreperson, it's an official document of the state. And even if it never went anywhere, even if it was never prosecuted on, even if it was never delivered to a judge, even if it was never made public, even if the case is old and closed, the public has a right to it. So Charlie Brennan, the dogged reporter whom you just interviewed, actually filed the appropriate documents and cited the appropriate statute, and the judge, who himself has not yet seen the grand jury indictment, made the appropriate decision under Colorado law. But I have to tell you, Allison, this is a bit of a head-scratcher, because a grand jury is basically under the control of a prosecutor. Remember, there's no judge there, there's no defense counsel there, there's no defendant there. It's just the prosecutor and the grand jurors and whatever witnesses the prosecutor wants to bring in. They only hear what the prosecutor wants them to hear, and they only take votes that the prosecutor wants them to take.
Yeah.
How and why and under what circumstances they could have voted to indict the Ramseys without the prosecutor wanting it to happen? We don't know.
Yes, very curious. Very quickly, Judge, why wouldn't they release the whole grand jury record so this reporter can see the breadth of everything they have? Why just the stuff against John and Patsy?
That's the $64,000 question, Allison, because we know what's in the indictment. What we want to know is, what did the grand jurors look at in order to vote this indictment? Guess what? Colorado law does not let him reveal what the grand jurors looked at. It only lets him reveal what the grand jurors signed, and they just signed the indictment.
Judge Napolitano, thanks so much for being with us and explaining it all.